Enslaved black labor was a foundational economic engine of the Western world, yet this truth is rarely told with honesty or clarity. When we look at the modern world around us, the highways, financial institutions, global trade networks, and industrial powerhouses of the United States and Europe, we are often taught to see progress as the result of innovation and hard work. But beneath that polished narrative lies a deeper story, one built on centuries of unpaid labor that shaped the very foundations of modern wealth. For more than 300 years, millions of black men, women, and children were forced to work without wages, rights, or recognition. Their labor fueled plantations, factories, ports, and entire industries. The profits from their work did not disappear into the past, they were reinvested, expanded, and passed down through generations, helping to create the economic systems that still dominate the world today. This was not a small or isolated chapter in history. It was a central pillar of Western development. Yet, this story is often softened, shortened, or skipped entirely. Many history books mention slavery briefly, but rarely explain how deeply it shaped global power, national wealth, and long-term inequality. Without understanding this foundation, it becomes impossible to fully understand the world we live in now. In this video, we are going to explore how enslaved black labor helped build the Western world, why its impact still matters today, and what lessons history offers us if we are willing to face it honestly. This is not about blame, it is about truth, clarity, and understanding how the past continues to shape the present. If you believe history should be told fully and accurately, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who value learning beyond the surface. Stay with us because the story you are about to hear changes how everything else makes sense. Slavery did not simply exist alongside the growth of the Western world. It was woven directly into the financial systems that powered that growth. As the foundations of modern economies were being laid, enslaved black people were not only seen as workers, but were systematically redefined as property within legal and financial frameworks. This transformation allowed human lives to be converted into numbers on paper, values that could be calculated, traded, and leveraged to generate expanding wealth far beyond the plantations where the labor itself took place. Once classified as property, enslaved individuals became assets that could be bought, sold, and transferred across generations. Their assigned monetary value rose and fell with age, skill, and physical condition, much like land or livestock in the same era. This valuation was not symbolic. It formed the backbone of financial transactions throughout the Atlantic world. Plantation owners used enslaved people as collateral to secure loans from banks, enabling them to purchase more land, expand production, and deepen their economic reach. In this way, the bodies of the enslaved were transformed into financial instruments, silently supporting the growth of banking institutions that would later become pillars of national economies. This system extended far beyond individual slaveholders. Insurance companies emerged to protect these investments, offering policies that compensated owners for the loss of enslaved laborers due to illness, injury, or death. Shipping companies calculated profits around human cargo, while merchants in distant cities speculated on commodities produced through forced labor. Every step of the process linked violence on the ground to prosperity in financial centers hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The wealth generated by this system did not remain isolated within agricultural regions. It flowed outward into urban development, manufacturing, and global trade networks. As industries expanded, the profits derived from enslaved labor were reinvested into new ventures. Railroads were financed, factories were constructed, and ports were modernized using capital that traced its origins back to unpaid work in fields and workshops. Entire regions rose to prominence because of this cycle, where extracted labor created commodities, commodities generated profits, and profits were reinvested to build enduring institutions. Over time, these institutions came to define economic success, while the source of their initial capital faded from public memory. Even when slavery formally ended, the financial structures it created did not simply dissolve. Banks that had once issued loans backed by human property continued operating, carrying forward accumulated wealth into a new era. Families who had benefited from generations of forced labor retained land, businesses, and political influence, while formerly enslaved people were released without resources or access to the systems their labor had helped build. The imbalance was not accidental. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed to concentrate wealth in one direction. Understanding slavery as a structured financial system changes how history comes into focus. It reveals that exploitation was not only enforced through physical control, but also through contracts, ledgers, and laws that normalized inequality. The Western world did not rise despite slavery. It rose in large part because slavery was embedded into its economic design. This reality helps explain why wealth and opportunity became so unevenly distributed, and why those patterns proved so difficult to dismantle. The past, preserved in financial systems and inherited advantage, continue to shape the present long after the chains were removed. As the financial systems built on slavery expanded and matured, the goods produced through forced labor began to reshape the world far beyond the fields where they were harvested. Cotton, sugar, and tobacco were not just agricultural products. They became the lifeblood of an emerging global economy. These commodities moved through ports, markets, and factories, connecting plantations in the Americas to industrial cities in Europe and transforming regional exploitation into worldwide prosperity. Cotton, in particular, became the quiet force behind the industrial age. In the 19th century, textile mills in Britain and the northern United States operated at an unprecedented scale, consuming vast quantities of raw fiber. That cotton arrived almost entirely from lands worked by enslaved people, whose labor turned soil into profit with relentless regularity. The spinning machines of Manchester, Liverpool, and New England did not operate in isolation. They depended on a steady flow of cotton produced through unpaid labor thousands of miles away. Every bale represented countless hours of human effort that went uncompensated, yet generated enormous returns once processed into cloth and sold across global markets. Sugar followed a similar path. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas supplied European demand for a commodity that had shifted from luxury to necessity. Refineries, shipping firms, and merchants grew wealthy by moving sugar through complex trade networks, while the labor that made it possible remained invisible to consumers enjoying its sweetness. Tobacco, too, shaped patterns of trade and consumption, creating steady revenue streams that strengthened colonial economies and fueled further expansion. Together, these commodities anchored international commerce and allowed industrial societies to grow at a pace that would have been impossible without coerced labor. The wealth generated from these goods did not remain tied to agriculture. Profits flowed into manufacturing, finance, and infrastructure, accelerating industrial development on both sides of the Atlantic. Railroads were built to move raw materials and finished products more efficiently. Ports expanded to handle increasing volumes of trade. Banks grew larger and more influential by financing enterprises linked to slave-produced commodities. Each advancement reinforced the next, creating a self-sustaining cycle of growth rooted in exploitation. What made this system so powerful was its distance. Consumers in European cities rarely saw the conditions under which these commodities were produced. Industrialists focused on output and efficiency, not the origins of their raw materials. As a result, the suffering that made prosperity possible was abstracted away, buried beneath layers of trade and transformation. This separation allowed societies to celebrate progress while ignoring the human cost embedded within it. When industrialization reached its peak, The economies of America and Europe were deeply intertwined with the legacy of slave labor. Even after slavery formally ended, industries continued to benefit from capital accumulated during its reign. Factories remained, trade routes persisted, and wealth stayed concentrated among those who had long controlled production and distribution. Formerly enslaved people, meanwhile, were left outside these systems, excluded from ownership and opportunity despite having laid the groundwork for industrial success. Seeing industrial growth through this lens reveals a more complete picture of how the modern world took shape. The factories, markets, and trade networks that defined progress were not built in isolation or fairness. They were powered by commodities extracted through forced labor and transformed into global wealth. This understanding ties together finance, industry, and history into a single narrative, showing that the rise of industrial power was inseparable from the labor that made it possible, and the inequalities that followed. When slavery formally ended, it was widely portrayed as a clean break from the past, a decisive moment when freedom replaced bondage and justice finally arrived. Yet the economic systems that had been built on forced labor did not disappear overnight, nor did the interests that depended on them. Instead, the structure of exploitation adapted, reshaping itself into new forms that preserved control over labor while avoiding the language of slavery. What followed emancipation was not true economic freedom, but a carefully managed transition that ensured wealth and power remained in the same hands. In the years immediately after the Civil War, Reconstruction offered a brief and fragile window of possibility. Newly freed black communities sought land, education, and political participation, hoping to build independent lives after generations of unpaid labor. For a moment, that future seemed attainable, but the economic foundations of the South had been shattered, and those who once profited from slavery were determined to restore a labor system that served their needs. Without land or capital, formerly enslaved people were forced into arrangements that tied their survival to the very plantations they had once worked under coercion. Sharecropping emerged as the dominant solution. On the surface, it appeared to offer autonomy, allowing black families to work plots of land in exchange for a portion of the harvest. In practice, it functioned as a cycle of dependency. Landowners controlled access to tools, seeds, and credit, setting terms that made debt nearly unavoidable. Each season ended with accounts that rarely balanced in favor of the worker, binding families to the same land year after year. Labor was no longer unpaid, but it was still trapped, its rewards systematically siphoned away through unequal contracts and manipulated bookkeeping. Alongside this system developed another, even harsher mechanism of control. Through newly enacted laws and aggressive policing, black men were disproportionately arrested for minor or vague offenses and placed into a system of convict leasing. Prisons supplied laborers to private businesses, mines, and farms, creating a workforce that could be exploited with little oversight. Companies paid the state, not the laborer, and conditions were often brutal. This arrangement restored forced labor under a legal framework, ensuring that industries continued to benefit from controlled, low-cost work while maintaining the appearance of lawful order. As these labor systems took hold, political power was systematically stripped away. Reconstruction governments collapsed, federal protections were withdrawn, and a rigid social order was enforced through Jim Crow laws. Segregation was not merely social, it was economic. Access to skilled jobs, fair wages, and education was restricted, preventing black communities from accumulating wealth or competing on equal footing. Opportunities that fueled growth elsewhere were deliberately placed out of reach, locking generations into disadvantage. These systems worked together to preserve the economic hierarchy established during slavery. Land remained concentrated among former slaveholding elites, while industries continued to draw value from labor that had little chance to advance. The profits generated during slavery had already been invested, expanded, and inherited, while those who had produced that wealth were denied entry into the structures that governed its distribution. Emancipation removed legal ownership of people, but it did not dismantle the economic logic that had defined them as expendable labor. Understanding this transition reveals why freedom alone was insufficient to undo centuries of exploitation. The end of slavery marked a shift in form, not function. By replacing chains with contracts and ownership with control, the system ensured continuity beneath the surface of change. This continuity explains why inequality persisted so stubbornly, and why the promise of emancipation remained unfulfilled for so many. The story of Reconstruction's collapse is not just a political failure. It is a reminder that economic justice requires more than legal declarations. Without structural change, exploitation finds new ways to survive. The story of America's economic foundation is inseparable from the story of black labor, a truth often hidden behind sanitized history books and simplified narratives. For centuries, black Americans were systematically excluded from the benefits of the very labor that built the nation, while white families reaped the advantages across generations, creating an enduring racial wealth gap that persists today. From the earliest days of slavery, black people were denied the most basic human rights, their labor extracted under brutal conditions without pay, recognition, or freedom. This labor extended far beyond the fields of cotton, sugar, and tobacco, encompassing skilled trades, construction, domestic work, and even the building of iconic American landmarks, laying the literal and figurative foundations upon which white families accumulated wealth. As emancipation arrived, it promised freedom on paper but delivered new forms of economic oppression in practice. Freed black individuals were systematically blocked from land ownership, trapped in exploitative labor arrangements such as sharecropping, and excluded from fair wages and educational opportunities that would allow them to thrive independently. Meanwhile, white families who had already built wealth through generations of slavery and unfair labor practices were able to transfer property, businesses, and financial advantages across generations, securing intergenerational prosperity. Institutions and policies reinforced this divide. Banks favored white borrowers, housing opportunities were racially restricted, and legal structures made it nearly impossible for black Americans to convert labor into lasting wealth. The result was a self-perpetuating system in which economic mobility for black families was systematically limited while white families expanded their holdings, investing in education, real estate, and industries that would continue to grow over decades. The consequences of these historical injustices extend into the modern era. Wealth, more than income, determines access to higher education, homeownership, capital for business ventures, and security during crisis, families that could pass down savings, investments, and property over generations gained compounding advantages, while those denied these opportunities struggled to gain a foothold in the same economic landscape. This imbalance is visible not only in household net worth but also in broader societal metrics such as educational attainment, employment in high-paying industries, and political influence. In essence, the structural barriers that followed the abolition of slavery ensured that the immense contributions of black labor fueled wealth for others while limiting the capacity of black Americans to build and sustain their own economic legacies. Understanding this context is crucial for grasping why the racial wealth gap remains one of the most persistent indicators of inequality in the United States. Policies and interventions aimed at closing this gap cannot succeed without acknowledging the historical accumulation of wealth by white families built on the exploitation of black labor and the deliberate obstruction of black economic advancement. Reconciliation requires more than recognition. It demands systemic efforts to level the playing field, including equitable access to education, capital, housing, and wealth-building opportunities that have long been denied. Only by tracing the lineage of wealth from its historical roots to contemporary disparities can society fully appreciate the depth of the challenges and craft solutions capable of fostering genuine economic justice. The story of intergenerational wealth, therefore, is not just a tale of prosperity but a cautionary narrative about structural inequality, inherited advantage, and the unbalanced legacies of labor and opportunity. It highlights how systemic denial of resources to an entire group while privileging another creates patterns that echo across centuries. It reminds us that while freedom may have been declared, economic equality has never been guaranteed, and the work of repairing these historic inequities remains urgent, demanding attention, awareness, and action from individuals, communities, and policymakers alike. This history challenges us to reconsider notions of fairness, to recognize the profound impacts of generational oppression, and to envision a future where access to opportunity and the fruits of labor are not determined by race, but by effort, talent, and the equitable structures that support them. It is a story that cannot be ignored, and one that must be confronted with clarity and courage if meaningful change is ever to be achieved. As we reflect on the story of black labor and its foundational role in building the wealth of the Western world, it becomes clear that the legacies of slavery are not confined to history books. They live on in the economic and social realities that shape the lives of millions today. The racial wealth gap, disparities in education, unequal access to housing and capital, and the concentration of opportunity all trace their roots back to centuries of systemic exclusion and exploitation. These are not the consequences of cultural shortcomings, individual failures, or lack of effort. They are the direct results of deliberate policies and practices that restricted Black Americans from fully participating in the economic life of the nation. Recognizing this truth is crucial because only by understanding the depth of structural inequality can meaningful solutions emerge. From the brutal systems of slavery to the oppressive measures of Reconstruction, sharecropping, Jim Crow law, and discriminatory lending and housing policies, black labor created immense wealth for others while being denied the tools to build its own legacy. Families who had endured generations of forced labor were blocked from accumulating assets that could be passed down, while white families consolidated and grew intergenerational wealth, creating an economic divide that persists to this day. Even when legal freedoms were won, the shadow of systemic oppression remained, shaping opportunities and outcomes across every sector of life. This context challenges the simplistic narratives that attribute current disparities to personal shortcomings and underscores the importance of historical awareness in addressing inequality. Yet, acknowledging this history is not a call to dwell in despair, it is a call to action. Understanding the mechanisms through which inequity was created empowers communities, policymakers, and individuals to implement strategies that address long-standing disparities. Investments in education, equitable access to housing and capital, support for Black-owned businesses, and reforms that dismantle structural barriers are essential steps toward closing the gap. By learning from the past and applying these lessons to present-day challenges, society can begin to repair the economic injustices that have lingered for centuries. This is also a reminder of the resilience, creativity, and strength of Black communities, who despite systemic oppression have continually built culture, innovation, and institutions that enrich society as a whole. Recognizing their contributions is not only a matter of historical accuracy, but also a step toward justice and equity. When we celebrate these achievements, we affirm the humanity, talent, and agency of those whose labor has too often been overlooked or exploited. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history, for engaging with these challenging truths, and for committing to understanding the forces that have shaped our world. If this video has offered you insight or provoked reflection, please consider supporting our channel by hitting the like button, sharing it with others, and subscribing for more content that explores untold stories and the realities behind the histories we think we know. By doing, you become part of a conversation that seeks to illuminate the past, understand the present, and work toward a more just future.